Before he told them the truth, he locked the door. 20% of a black family's hard-built fortune, 3 generations of sacrifice, of clawing space out of a world that tried to deny them every inch of it, was about to be handed to a stranger none of them had ever met. A mother buried a secret to protect her siblings. A father buried a son to protect his name. And in the last year of his life, a proud, complicated man wrote one final letter, designed to make sure that nothing his children hid from each other, and from themselves, would ever stay hidden again. This is the story of a family who thought they were burying their father. What they were actually doing was digging up everything he spent a lifetime trying to bury first. Stay until the very end, because the last chapter will change how you see every person in this story, including the one you think you understand the most. If a story like this makes you think about your own family, the ones you love and the ones you've never quite forgiven, you are exactly who this was written for. Welcome back to Mind Maze Tales. Harold Jennings died on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, seated in the leather chair of his study, in the home he had built with his own 2 hands, before he ever had the money to pay someone else to build it for him. He was 81 years old, a man who had turned a single tract of undeveloped land on the outskirts of Atlanta into one of the largest black-owned real estate and construction firms in the Southeast, brick by brick, contract by contract, in a business world that had not made a single inch of that climb easy for him. He was a man who had spent the final decade of his life saying far less than he knew, and holding far more than his children ever suspected. His housekeeper, Miss Odessa, who had worked for the Jennings family for almost 30 years, found him just after 9 that morning, a cup of tea gone cold on the small table beside him. She had known Harold long enough to recognize his moods from the shape of his shoulders alone, and she would say later, to anyone who asked, that he had seemed at peace that final week, quieter than usual but not troubled, a man who had finally set something down he'd been carrying a long time. By noon, his 3 grown children had been notified. By evening, the family home on Sweetwater Ridge was filled with the particular kind of silence that only follows a sudden loss, the kind where grief and calculation arrive in the very same breath, and no one is quite sure yet which one is speaking loudest. Marion Jennings Reed arrived first, as she always did. She was 52 years old, the eldest, composed in the specific way a woman becomes composed when she has spent her whole life being watched. First by a demanding father, later by a family that leaned on her to hold things together. She walked through her father's house that morning touching nothing, as if the furniture itself might report back to somebody. She stood a long while in the doorway of his study, looking at the empty chair where he had taken his last breath, and told herself that the tightness in her chest was only grief. She would not let herself consider, not yet, that some of it might be dread. She had always been the one who arrived first at every family crisis, who called the doctors, who wrote the checks, who kept the calendar of who needed to be where and when. Standing in that study now, she felt for the first time in years the strange sensation of not knowing what came next, of having no list to make. Desmond arrived an hour later, younger than Marion by 6 years, restless in the particular way grief makes some men restless, turning sorrow into motion, into tasks, into anything that didn't require sitting still with the feeling itself. He was already on the phone with the family's longtime attorney before he'd taken off his coat, asking about paperwork, about next steps, about anything that could be organized and controlled. Desmond ran the day-to-day of Jennings Construction's newer developments, a job that had never quite earned him the same easy respect his father commanded, and in the raw hours after his father's death, he found himself gripping his phone, the way a drowning man grips whatever floats. Simone, the youngest at 41, arrived last and said the least. She stood in the study doorway for a long time before finally stepping inside, and when she did, she went straight to her father's desk and sat down in his chair, as if she needed to understand, physically, what the room had looked like in his final moments. Simone had always been the quiet one, the observer, the daughter who noticed things nobody asked her to notice. She had spent the last year of her father's life sensing that something in him had shifted, some private weight he was carrying that he refused to name, and sitting now in his chair, breathing in the smell of his pipe tobacco still clinging faintly to the leather, She felt the old, familiar frustration of having sensed something important and never having been trusted with what it was. They didn't talk much that first night. Marian made tea nobody drank. Desmond made calls nobody returned. Simone sat for hours going through drawers she'd never been allowed to open while her father was alive, finding nothing more remarkable than old receipts and a decade of birthday cards from all three of his children, tied together with kitchen string, sorted carefully by year, the kind of thing a hard man does in private that he'd never admit to doing in front of anybody. She found, too, an old photograph tucked behind a stack of business ledgers, faded and curling at the edges, of her father as a much younger man, standing in front of a half-finished building with his sleeves rolled up and a look of fierce pride on his face. She did not know, looking at it, that the photograph had been taken the same year Eleanor Cole started working in his office. The funeral was held 4 days later, on a gray Saturday morning that suited the occasion. Harold had left a note with Miss Odessa, specifying that the service be simple, dignified, without excess. He had never been a man for excess, not even in death. The family sat together in the front pew of Mount Calvary Baptist, a church that smelled of cedar polish and lilies, surrounded by 3 generations of Atlanta's black business community, city councilmen, old church deacons, men who had worked construction sites with Harold 40 years earlier when nobody would lend a black contractor a dime. The pastor spoke of Harold's legacy, of the scholarships he'd quietly funded for young black tradesmen over the decades, of the way he'd rebuilt 6 churches in the community after storm damage without ever once sending an invoice. For those 2 hours, whatever tension lived between the 3 siblings was folded neatly away, the way grief demands. Marian did not cry. Desmond cried once, briefly, embarrassed by it in front of so many familiar faces. Simone stood very still and stared at the casket like she expected her father to say one more thing before it closed. Some final instruction, some answer to the strange thing he'd said to her, months before he passed, about an old debt he still needed to settle. It was at the repast afterward, in the same house where all 3 of them had been raised, that they first noticed the man none of them recognized. He stood near the back of the room in a simple dark suit, holding a cup of coffee he never drank. He looked to be around 40, quiet in his manner, easy to overlook, except Marian could not overlook him. Her eyes kept drifting back to his face 3 separate times that afternoon, unable to place the unease it stirred in her, until it finally landed. His eyes were her father's eyes. Not similar, not reminiscent, the exact same shape, the exact same deep brown, set into a face that shared nothing else in common with anyone standing in that room. She approached him once, more out of hostess instinct than curiosity, and asked how he'd known her father. His answer told her nothing. He'd done professional work for Harold over the years, he said, and wanted to pay his respects. Something about the answer felt rehearsed, too smooth, and she walked away more unsettled than before she'd asked. She told herself again it was nothing. A stranger, a business contact. But she watched him the rest of the afternoon, and she noticed that he, too, seemed to be watching the family, with the patient attention of a man waiting for the right moment, not a guest simply passing through a room of strangers. At one point she caught him watching Simone laugh at something an old family friend had said, and his expression, just for a second, softened into something that looked almost like longing, before he caught himself and looked away. In the 2 days between the repast and the reading, the siblings each found themselves, separately, thinking more about the stranger in the dark suit than about the will itself. Marian drove past the old office building where her father had once employed a full staff of secretaries and clerks, now converted into loft apartments, and found herself wondering, for the first time in decades, what had actually happened to Eleanor Cole. Desmond called Mr. Whitfield's office 3 more times, growing more agitated with each unanswered message, a species of anxiety he recognized from every other moment in his life when he sensed control slipping away from him before he'd even identified the threat. Simone, characteristically, said nothing to either of her siblings about her own suspicions, choosing instead to sit with the discomfort quietly, the way she always did, turning it over in private until she had something worth saying. The right moment came 2 days later. The family gathered in Harold's study for the reading of the will, per a letter Harold had left with his bank, instructing that the reading happen exactly 1 week after his death, in that specific room, with all 3 of his children present, and no one else. Desmond had assumed their longtime family attorney, Mr. Whitfield, would be the one conducting it, and had said as much to Marian the night before, irritated that Whitfield hadn't yet returned his calls. Instead, when the study door opened that morning, it was the same man from the repast who stepped through it, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm, closing the door quietly behind him. "My name is Julian Cole," he said, taking the seat across from all 3 of them at Harold's old mahogany desk. "I've been asked to serve as executor of your father's estate." Marian felt the same cold recognition she'd felt 2 days earlier, sharper now, close enough to touch. Desmond frowned, trying to place the name and failing, and demanded, with barely concealed irritation, to know where Whitfield was, and why a man none of them had properly met was holding the folder that would shape the rest of their lives. Simone said nothing at all. She only watched Julian with the stillness of someone who already sensed that whatever was about to happen in that room would not resemble any ordinary reading of a will. Julian opened the folder, but didn't begin reading right away. He looked at each of them in turn, Marian, then Desmond, then Simone, with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite a warning, but something suspended between the two. He seemed, for just a moment, to be gathering courage for something he'd clearly rehearsed 100 different ways in private, and had still not found an easy version of. Then he stood, crossed the small room, and turned the lock on the study door. "Before I read this," he said, turning back to face them, "you should know, I have a personal stake in what's written here." For a moment, none of them answered. Desmond opened his mouth to demand what exactly that meant, but something in Julian's face stopped him, a tiredness that didn't match the confidence of a man running a con, more like the tiredness of somebody who had waited a long time to finally say a sentence he'd never found an easy way to say. Marian's hands tightened in her lap. She'd spent 2 days telling herself the resemblance she thought she saw was grief playing tricks on her, the way grief sometimes reshapes a stranger's face into the shape of someone recently lost. Sitting across from him now, in the full light of the study window, she understood she'd been lying to herself since the moment she first noticed his eyes. Simone was the only one who didn't look surprised. She'd spent her father's last year watching him grow distant in a way she never fully understood, disappearing for entire afternoons, taking calls behind a closed study door he never explained afterward. She'd asked him once, gently, if something was troubling him. He told her only that there was an old debt he intended to settle before he ran out of time. She'd assumed, back then, he meant something financial. Watching Julian's carefully composed face now, she suspected she'd been wrong about that. The lock clicking into place had done more to unsettle the room than anything Julian had said. Desmond half rose out of his chair, demanding to know what was happening, and whether this whole arrangement was some kind of legal maneuver, whether Julian was even a real licensed attorney, or whether the entire thing had been staged to isolate 3 grieving siblings behind a locked door. Marian stayed seated, watching Julian, her unease sliding steadily into dread. Simone alone remained calm, as though some part of her had been bracing for a moment exactly like this one since the year their father began retreating into silence. Julian returned to his seat without explaining the lock, asking only that they let him finish reading before the questions came, promising everything would be explained in time. Desmond sat back down, reluctantly, exchanging a look with Marian that carried decades of shared sibling shorthand, a silent agreement to let it play out before things escalated further. Julian opened the folder and began reading the will exactly as Harold had written it, in his own careful legal language, the standard clauses regarding the family home, the company shares, modest bequests to longtime staff. Miss Odessa, who'd worked for the family 30 years, was left a sum generous enough to retire on. The foreman who'd run Harold's very first construction crew back in the 60s, now in his 80s himself, was named too, along with a small handwritten note thanking him for believing in a young man nobody else would hire on. For several minutes, It sounded like an ordinary will, the kind any prominent Atlanta family might expect. Desmond visibly relaxed, glancing at his watch. Marian did not. She'd noticed something in the careful stillness of Julian's shoulders that told her the ordinary part of this reading was almost over. Then Julian reached a clause near the middle of the document, and his voice didn't change, but the room did. The will stated that 20% of Harold Jennings's total estate, a sum touching every property, every share of the company, every dollar the man had spent a lifetime accumulating against every obstacle a black man of his generation had faced, was to be held in trust for, in the document's exact wording, a beneficiary, to be named at the appropriate time, whose claim to this family predates any document I have signed in my lifetime. Desmond stood fully this time, his chair scraping hard against the floor. He accused Julian outright of manipulating the will, of inserting language that never came from his father, of using his position as executor to carve out a fortune for some unnamed party who conveniently happened to be represented by the very man reading the will aloud. He demanded to see the original document, to compare the signature against samples he knew from his father's other papers, insisting no responsible attorney would let an ambiguous clause like that stand unchallenged in a will this size. He reminded Julian, his voice climbing, that their family had spent decades building something out of nothing, that every dollar in that estate represented a fight their grandfather and father had waged against banks and city councils and competitors who never wanted to see a black-owned firm succeed, and he would not stand by and watch a stranger walk in and claim a piece of it on the strength of a single paragraph. Simone, watching her brother's fury build, found herself thinking not of the money at all, but of the strange, unplaceable familiarity she'd felt toward Julian since the moment she first saw him standing near the back of the repast, holding a cup of coffee he never touched. She had assumed, at the time, it was simply the ordinary unease of noticing a stranger among family. Sitting across from him now, watching the careful way he held himself, the particular stillness in his hands when he wasn't speaking, she began to wonder if some instinct in her had recognized something the rest of her mind hadn't yet caught up to. Marian didn't defend Julian, but she didn't join Desmond's accusation either. She sat very still, turning something over in her mind, some memory trying to surface she wasn't ready to name yet, and it was Simone who finally spoke, not to Julian, but to her sister. "Do you remember," Simone said slowly, her eyes on Marian, "the year before he got sick, when Daddy kept saying he had a debt from the past he needed to settle? I thought he meant the business. I don't think he meant the business." Marian's silence answered a question none of them had asked yet. Desmond looked between his sisters, sensing something existed between them he'd never been told about, some private history that had been unfolding in rooms he wasn't invited into. He asked Marian directly, his voice sharpening, whether she knew something the rest of them didn't. Marian opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had no smooth response ready, and it was in that exact moment, watching Marian's carefully composed face begin, very slightly, to crack, that Julian set the will down on the desk. "There is a fourth child," he said quietly, "and I've known him my whole life, because it's me." For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Desmond let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh a person gives when the alternative to laughing feels far worse. He told Julian plainly he didn't believe a word of it, that a man could walk into any lawyer's office in the country and claim to be the long-lost heir of a dead millionaire, and that grief did strange things to a family, but it did not make them stupid. He reminded Julian, voice climbing with every sentence, that the Jennings family had resources of their own, attorneys, investigators, and that whatever scheme Julian believed he was running would collapse the second it faced real scrutiny. He stood and paced the small room, running a hand over his face, muttering that this was exactly the kind of thing that happened to black families the moment there was real money on the table, that vultures always seemed to circle when there was an estate worth fighting over. Marian did not laugh. She sat with her eyes fixed on Julian's face, on the eyes she'd recognized at the repast 2 days earlier without being able to name them, and said nothing at all, which unsettled Desmond nearly as much as the claim itself. He turned to her. demanding to know why she wasn't equally outraged, why she was sitting there in silence, as though some part of her had already accepted what Julian was saying. Desmond kept going, insisting that if Julian truly believed this claim, he'd better be ready to defend it in court, because they would not simply hand over a fifth of their father's estate on the word of a man who had appeared, uninvited, at both a funeral and a private family reading. He accused Julian of fraud outright, of preying on a grieving family in its most vulnerable moment, timing his appearance precisely to exploit the confusion of the days right after a death, and demanded he unlock the door immediately, threatening to call the police if he refused. Julian didn't unlock the door, and he didn't react to the threat with any visible fear either, which struck Simone as strange behavior for a man supposedly running a con. He sat with his hands folded, letting Desmond's fury run its course, absorbing the accusations without flinching, the way a man absorbs weather he's already braced for. When Desmond finally paused for breath, Julian spoke again, quietly. "I understand exactly why you don't believe me," he said. "I wouldn't believe me either, sitting where you're sitting, but I'm not asking you to take my word for it." He reached into his leather folder and withdrew a second document, separate from the will, sealed in an envelope soft at the edges with age. The ink across its front faded from time. He set it on the desk without opening it, his hand resting on it a moment, as if he needed that beat to steady himself before continuing. "This letter," he said, "is in your father's handwriting. It was written 38 years ago. I have never opened it. I was told only to bring it here, to this room, and to show it to you, if this exact conversation ever happened the way it just did." Desmond stared at the envelope without touching it, his earlier certainty visibly wavering now that the proof in front of him had moved beyond a stranger's claim, into something carrying the weight of his father's own hand. He asked Julian, in a quieter voice than he'd used all afternoon, how long he'd been carrying that envelope, and whether he'd ever been tempted to open it himself. Julian admitted honestly that he had, more times than he could count, especially in the months after his mother finally told him, at long last, whose child he truly was. Eleanor had kept the envelope sealed in a fireproof lockbox for nearly 4 decades, he said, carrying it through every apartment and house they'd ever lived in, telling him only that it was meant for a day that might never come. He'd held it a dozen times over the years, turned it over in his hands, felt its weight, wondered what words a father he'd never met might have chosen to write to a woman he'd abandoned before his own son was even born. He'd never broken the seal. Some part of him always understood the letter wasn't truly his to open until this room, this family, was finally ready to receive whatever it held. Desmond's fury faltered slightly at that, though he wasn't ready to fully surrender his skepticism. He snatched the envelope off the desk before Julian could stop him, turning it over roughly, searching for some sign of forgery, some detail to expose the whole scheme. Simone reached for it before either of her siblings could react further, taking it gently from her brother's hands, studying the handwriting the way someone studies a signature they've seen on birthday cards their whole life. She confirmed quietly it was their father's hand, the same slight leftward slant he'd never corrected, the same way he crossed his sevens she used to tease him about as a girl. The envelope was addressed to a single name. Marian's face went pale the instant she read it over her sister's shoulder. The name written across the front, in Harold Jennings's own hand, 38 years old and never opened, was Eleanor Cole. And Marian recognized it instantly, because Eleanor Cole had been their father's secretary, the woman who vanished from their lives without a word of explanation, the year Marian turned 10. A woman Marian had liked as a child, who'd once given her a small paper flower she kept for years afterward without ever understanding why her father's face darkened whenever her name came up again. Marian sat with that memory now, turning it in a new light. She remembered, faintly, a summer when the house had felt different, her mother quieter than usual at dinner, her father working longer hours than she'd ever seen. She remembered Eleanor's desk sitting empty one Monday morning, with nobody offering an explanation for why the woman who'd answered the office phones for as long as Marian could recall had simply stopped coming. As a child, she'd assumed adults just left jobs sometimes without warning, the way so many things in the grown-up world happened without explanation. She had never once considered the explanation had been living inside her own house the whole time, folded into her father's silences. She thought, too, of her mother, dead now nearly 15 years, and wondered, with a fresh ache, how much of this her mother had known, and how much of her own quiet sadness in those later years had come from carrying a version of this same secret. Desmond, watching his sister's face change as she stared at the envelope, felt something shift in his own chest as well, though he was slower to let go of his anger than Marion had been to let go of her denial. He had built his entire adult identity around being the one who protected this family's name and legacy, the one who showed up at city council meetings and Chamber of Commerce dinners, representing everything their grandfather had fought to build. The idea that some hidden piece of that legacy had been sitting 3 hours away in another town his entire life, raised by a woman his own family had paid to disappear, felt to him less like a family secret and more like a wound in the very foundation he'd spent his career standing on. He asked Julian, his voice quieter now but no less pointed, whether he understood what it meant to grow up believing your family's story was one thing, only to learn as a grown man that an entire chapter of it had been kept from you on purpose. Julian answered that he understood it better than anyone in that room could imagine, having spent his own childhood on the opposite end of exactly that kind of omission, a truth that landed on Desmond with more weight than he expected, forcing him to sit back down and simply listen for the first time since the reading began. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what happened decades earlier, in a version of the Jennings family none of Harold's 3 children ever fully saw. A version that existed before any of them were born, back when Harold himself was still a young man trying to prove he deserved a business his own father had built from nothing but a mule, a truck, and a stubborn refusal to be turned away from every bank in Fulton County. Eleanor Cole came to work for Harold's father, the original founder of Jennings Construction, as a young secretary with a sharp mind and a discretion that made her invaluable in an office full of men who didn't always want their conversations remembered accurately. She had grown up 2 neighborhoods over from the Jennings family, the daughter of a seamstress and a Pullman porter, and she had a reputation in the office for keeping the books straighter than anyone the elder Jennings had ever hired. She was quick with numbers, quicker with people, and within 2 years had become someone Harold relied on more than he probably should have. Long hours in the same office, late evenings reviewing contracts together, the particular closeness that grows between 2 people who spend more time with each other than with anyone else in their lives. The elder Jennings, Harold's father, was a man whose own life had been shaped by refusal after refusal, banks that wouldn't extend him credit, white contractors who tried to undercut every bid he made, city inspectors who found reasons to delay his permits that never seemed to delay anyone else's. He had built Jennings Construction not simply as a business but as a fortress, a proof to himself and to his children that a black family could hold something in this city that nobody could take away from them. It was that same fierce, protective instinct, twisted by fear rather than reason, that led him to see Eleanor's pregnancy not as a grandchild, but as a liability, a crack in the fortress he had spent his life building brick by brick. What began as professional closeness became something neither Harold nor Eleanor had planned for, and by the time Eleanor learned she was pregnant, Harold's own father had already made his position clear without ever needing to raise his voice. He'd built a name in this city through discipline and reputation, in a time when a single scandal could cost a black businessman contracts, respect, everything he'd fought for, and he was not about to let either be threatened by what he called, in his own words, a young man's foolishness. He had seen, in his own lifetime, how quickly white banks and city officials looked for any excuse to deny a black-owned company credit or contracts, and he was determined that his own son's private failings would never become public ammunition against everything the family had built. The family name would not be attached to a scandal. Eleanor was offered a settlement, generous by the standards of the time, on the condition she relocate quietly, sever all contact with the family, and never speak Harold's name in connection to the child she carried. Harold, still under his father's authority both financially and professionally, did not fight the arrangement the way, in later years, he'd tell himself he should have. He was, at the time, a young man more afraid of his father's disapproval than committed to the woman he claimed to love, a failure he'd carry quietly the rest of his life, long after his father was gone, and the authority that once controlled him had passed fully into his own hands. Eleanor left within the month, carrying a child she hadn't asked for under circumstances she'd never chosen, and raised her son alone in a small town 3 hours from Atlanta, telling him only, when he was old enough to ask, that his father couldn't be part of his life, and that some things were easier accepted than explained. She built a modest, steady life, bookkeeping for a small accounting firm, teaching Sunday school at her church, never remarrying, never fully explaining to her son, even in his adulthood, exactly who his father had been, though she never denied he existed, or that he'd once, briefly, meant something to her. She raised Julian to be proud, careful, and disciplined, telling him always that his name was his own to build, regardless of what he never received from the man who gave him half his blood. That son was Julian. For decades, Eleanor kept her word, accepting a monthly payment through a private account, never contacting the family, never confirming to Julian who his father was, deflecting his occasional questions with the same gentle non-answers she'd used since his childhood. It was only 3 years before Harold's death, when age and illness had begun softening the old rigidities that governed him, and when the weight of a secret carried for nearly 4 decades had finally grown heavier than his fear of confronting it, that Harold reached out to Eleanor directly, and, through her, to the son he had never met. Back in the locked study, Simone had already begun piecing this history together on her own, her mind working through it the way she always worked through hard things, quietly, methodically, without announcing her conclusions until she was certain. Julian didn't yet share the full account with his newfound siblings, but he confirmed enough. The town, the timeline, his mother's name, for Marian to feel the floor of her understanding shift permanently beneath her. She excused herself, claiming she needed air, and instead made her way to the estate's old records office down the hall, where decades of company documents sat forgotten in filing cabinets nobody had touched in years, the room smelling faintly of dust and old paper, its single window letting in a thin gray light. She was searching, she told herself, only to disprove what she already feared true. Instead, buried in a payroll ledger 38 years old, pages brittle and crackling under her fingers, she found the name Eleanor Cole, attached to a line of monthly payments that, according to the ledger's final entries, continued without interruption for 18 years. Ending in the exact year, Marian realized with a chill spreading through her whole body that Julian would have turned 18. She sat alone in that records office a long while, ledger open across her lap, listening to her siblings' muffled voices down the hall. She thought of her father as she'd known him, stern in business, gentle at home, a man who had never once raised his voice at any of his children, and tried to reconcile that memory with a young man who'd let his own father erase a woman and a child from his life without a fight. She found, to her own discomfort, that she couldn't fully condemn him for it. She understood, better than her siblings might, what it meant to make a choice out of fear, and spend years quietly managing its consequences, instead of admitting to it outright. It was, she realized with a growing unease, a pattern running through this family, in ways she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. When Marian returned to the study, ledger in hand, she said nothing at first, only set it down in front of her siblings and watched their faces as they understood what she'd found. Desmond stared at the faded columns of numbers, at the name Eleanor Cole repeated month after month for 18 straight years, and felt his certainty begin to waver, though he wasn't ready to fully let go of his suspicion yet. His anger, cooled briefly in the last chapter, came roaring back, redirected now toward a sharper target. If Julian had known about this payment history, he said, voice tight, if he'd known his entire life who his father truly was, then his sudden appearance now, right after Harold's death, conveniently positioned as the very executor controlling the reading, was not the behavior of an innocent, long-lost relative. It was the behavior of a man who'd spent years quietly engineering his way into a law career and, eventually, into this exact room, using a genuinely hard childhood as convenient cover for a plan decades in the making. Julian listened without visible offense, though something in his expression tightened, a flicker of old pain crossing his face before he composed himself again. He explained, calm and unhurried, that he hadn't known his father's identity until 3 years earlier, when Harold, already in declining health, contacted Eleanor directly for the first time in nearly 4 decades and asked to meet the son he'd never acknowledged. He described growing up with only fragments, a father who couldn't be part of his life, a monthly payment his mother never fully explained, a question he'd learned, eventually, to stop asking, because it only ever led to her tired, careful silence. He remembered, he said, asking her once, at maybe 14, whether his father was ashamed of him, and the way her face had crumpled before she told him, firmly, that shame had never once belonged to either of them. Julian described that first meeting only briefly. A quiet lunch 2 hours outside Atlanta, an old man apologizing for 38 years of silence, asking, with no promise attached, whether Julian might be willing to know him in whatever time he had left. He remembered sitting across from a stranger who shared his exact eyes, feeling an anger he hadn't expected, followed by something more complicated, a cautious, reluctant curiosity he'd spent the following 3 years slowly allowing himself to indulge. He told them, quietly, that it had taken him nearly a year to agree to see Harold a second time, and even longer to stop rehearsing, in his head, all the things he wanted to say to punish the old man for the childhood he'd missed. Marian asked the question forming in her mind since she found the ledger. If this was true, if Harold genuinely wanted to make things right, why involve Julian in the estate at all? And why as executor specifically, rather than simply naming him a beneficiary and letting an independent party manage the will's execution? Simone, listening closely, asked her own question before Julian could answer Marian's. What had it actually been like, growing up the way he had, knowing there was a father out there who could have claimed him and never did? Julian considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. He said there had been whole seasons of his childhood where he simply didn't think about it, busy with school, with baseball, with the ordinary business of growing up in a small town where everybody knew everybody's business except his own. And then there were other seasons, usually around his birthday or on Father's Day, when the absence felt like a physical thing, a hole shaped exactly like a man he'd never met, and he'd catch his mother watching him with an expression of guilt so heavy it made him stop asking questions just to spare her the look on her face. He said he'd told himself, for years, that whoever his father was, the man clearly hadn't wanted him, and that it was easier to build a life around that assumption than to keep hoping for something that never came. Julian's answer came slowly, as though he'd turned the question over himself many times before ever walking into this room. Your father did not entirely trust the 3 of you to divide his estate honestly among yourselves, he said. He told me that himself, more than once, in his final year. He said he'd spent years watching patterns in this family that concerned him, patterns he couldn't fully explain, and that he wanted someone impartial handling the reading, someone with no history of resentment or favoritism toward any of you. I did not choose this role for the inheritance, Marian. I very nearly refused it, twice, and only agreed after he asked me directly what I thought he owed the children he'd actually raised. I told him honestly, more than he'd given them credit for. Desmond demanded proof of paternity, proof of anything beyond an old letter and a payroll ledger that could theoretically be explained a dozen other ways. It was, in fairness, a reasonable demand, and Julian didn't resist it. He said he had anticipated this exact moment, had rehearsed, on the long drive to the house that morning, exactly how he would present what he was about to show them, understanding that no family, however grief-stricken, could reasonably be expected to reorganize their entire understanding of their father on the strength of an old letter and a name in a ledger alone. He reached into the leather folder one final time and withdrew a single notarized sheet, dated nearly 2 years before Harold's death. He set it on the desk without a word, and the document, when Marian picked it up with hands that had begun, faintly, to shake, was a paternity test confirming, with a certainty of 99.9%, that Harold Jennings had been Julian Cole's biological father. Desmond took the paper from his sister's hands and read it twice, as though a second reading might change the result. He'd built his entire opposition on the assumption this moment would never arrive. Now that it had, he found nothing left to argue against, only the slow, uncomfortable work of rearranging 38 years of family history around a brother he hadn't known existed that morning. He sat back down heavily, running both hands over his face, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Mon mean. Simone, watching her brother's hands tremble slightly as he set the document down, felt the room shift permanently, the last thin wall of denial giving way to a truth none of them could pretend not to see any longer. The paternity test did what nothing else in the room had managed. It silenced Desmond entirely, at least for the moment, and left Simone sitting very still, hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the document as though it might rearrange itself into something less permanent if she looked long enough. Marian set it down carefully, as if it were something that might shatter, and said nothing, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation she'd been dreading since the moment Julian first spoke his name. It was Julian who broke the silence, explaining that Harold had left one more item with the family's private banker, to be released only under a very specific condition, that Julian ever formally came forward to the family as his son. That condition had now been met. Julian retrieved a small audio recorder from his folder, setting it on the desk between them, his fingers hesitating over the button before he finally pressed it. What followed was Harold Jennings's own voice, recorded months before his death, weaker than any of his children remembered, but unmistakably him, speaking with the careful deliberation of a man who'd rehearsed this many times, pausing every so often, as if gathering strength between sentences. In the background of the recording, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of the same grandfather clock that still ticked in the corner of the study where they now sat. He began by acknowledging his own cowardice. He admitted that as a young man, he'd let his own father erase Eleanor and the child she carried from his life, not because he believed it was right, but because he lacked the courage, at that age, to defy a man who controlled both his inheritance and his place in the business. He said that for nearly 4 decades, that decision sat in him like a stone he could never fully set down. That he'd thought of Julian on every one of his birthdays, wondered what he looked like, what kind of man he'd become, and done nothing about it, choosing comfort over conscience for longer than he was ever proud to admit. He spoke of standing outside Julian's high school graduation once, decades ago, in a car parked across the street, watching from a distance, too afraid even then to approach and introduce himself, and driving away before the ceremony even ended. He said that in his final years, watching his 3 children grow into adults he loved but didn't always understand, he'd become determined to correct, in whatever time remained, at least one of the wrongs he'd spent his life avoiding. He spoke of Marian with particular tenderness here, acknowledging he'd placed an unfair burden on her 5 years earlier, by confiding in her alone rather than finding the courage to tell all 3 of his children together, and that whatever choices she'd made since then were, in some measure, a consequence of a weight he never should have asked her to carry by herself. "I made you keep my secret," his recorded voice said, "and I am sorry that in doing so, I may have taught you it was all right to keep your own." He spoke, too, of Desmond, saying he had watched his son work harder than either of his sisters ever had, to prove himself worthy of the family name, and that he regretted never once telling Desmond, plainly, how proud he was of that effort, fearing it would soften a young man he believed needed toughening for a business world that showed no mercy to black men, even ones with money. And he spoke of Simone, the daughter he said understood him best without ever needing him to explain himself, and asked that she be given whatever role in the family's future she was willing to accept, trusting her judgment above his own by that point in his life. He explained the structure of the will, the 20% held in trust, the decision to name Julian executor instead of simply a beneficiary, as a way to ensure his son would be present, seen, and treated as family in the room where the family's future would be decided, rather than a name on a document to be argued over and dismissed without anyone having to look him in the eye. He apologized, directly, to Julian. For 38 years of absence no apology could ever fully repair, his voice audibly breaking for the first time on the recording. And then, just as it seemed to be reaching its natural end, Harold's voice added one final line, quieter than the rest, as if he'd almost decided not to include it at all. "And Marion," he said, "you already knew. I told you 5 years ago. I'm sorry you had to carry that secret alone." The recording clicked off, and the silence that followed felt different from every silence before it in that room. Not the silence of shock, not disbelief, the silence of a family realizing the version of events they'd each quietly lived with. The story they told themselves about who knew what and when had just been rewritten by a dead man's voice, and none of them yet knew what to do with it. For several seconds, the only sound in the study was Simone's breathing, sharp and uneven, as she turned to look at her sister with an expression Marion had never seen on her face before, something between betrayal and disbelief, cutting deeper than any argument the two of them had ever had. Desmond turned toward Marion too, and whatever fragile composure had returned to the room in the last chapter dissolved completely. Marion didn't try to deny it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she'd held since the reading began, and after a long moment, she started to speak, her voice quieter than her siblings had ever heard it, stripped of the careful control she'd carried through every crisis this family had ever faced. 5 years ago, she said, their father had called her alone into this very study, late one evening after everyone else had gone home, and told her everything: Eleanor, the payments, the son he'd never acknowledged, and his growing wish, even then, to bring Julian into the family in some form before he died. He'd asked Marion specifically for her blessing, sitting exactly where Julian now sat, his hands trembling slightly, and she had given him neither blessing nor understanding. She'd told him that revealing a secret like that so late in life would only fracture a family that had already spent decades finding its balance, that Desmond's temper and Simone's idealism wouldn't survive a revelation of that size, and that some truths, however unfair to bury, were kinder left buried. She admitted, her voice catching, that this hadn't been the whole of her reasoning. She admitted, because there was no use hiding it now, that some smaller, uglier part of her calculation had involved the estate itself, an unspoken awareness that a fourth heir, however morally entitled, meant a smaller share for the 3 children raised to believe they were their father's only family. She'd told herself, for 5 years, she was protecting her siblings. She had never fully admitted, until this moment, sitting in the very room where the secret was first given to her, that she'd also been protecting herself, and the comfortable position she'd always held as the eldest, the most trusted, the one who managed the family's affairs while their father grew older. Desmond stared at his sister as though seeing her for the first time, the betrayal compounding, in his mind, with a decade of smaller grievances he'd never quite been able to name, moments when Marion's advice always somehow served her own interests, just slightly more than anyone else's, moments he'd dismissed at the time as simple coincidence. He remembered, suddenly, a conversation 2 years earlier when Marion had gently discouraged him from asking their father directly about certain business decisions, telling him it would only upset a sick old man, and he wondered now how much of that advice had been protecting their father, and how much had been protecting her. Simone's reaction was quieter but sharper. She'd gone very still, her earlier compassion for Marion curdling into something colder, turning over a new thought that reached beyond the secret Marion had just confessed. She thought back to a dinner nearly 4 years earlier, when Marion had seemed unusually distracted, excusing herself twice to take calls she never explained, and Simone remembered thinking nothing of it at the time, chalking it up to the ordinary stress of managing their father's affairs. Sitting in the study now, she understood that whatever call Marion had taken that evening might well have been about Julian, about the estate, about a secret Simone herself had been sitting 3 feet away from, without ever suspecting it. "If you knew about him," Simone said slowly, eyes fixed on her sister, "did you know he was working at Daddy's firm? Did you know he was the one drafting Daddy's contracts for the last 3 years?" The question hung in the air far longer than it should have taken to answer. Desmond looked between his sisters again, sensing the ground had shifted once more, into territory with nothing to do with Julian's parentage, and everything to do with what else might have quietly happened around him without his knowledge. He thought back over the last 3 years, trying to recall any signature, any document, any conversation that might now look different in the light of what Simone was suggesting, and found, with growing unease, that there were more of them than he wanted to admit. The question landed with a different weight than anything before it, because it wasn't aimed at the secret of Julian's identity. It was aimed at something else entirely, a second layer of concealment buried beneath the first. Marian hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told Simone everything before her sister said a single word. Yes, Marian finally admitted. She'd known, in general terms, that a young attorney handling some of their father's affairs was connected to Eleanor, though she'd told herself she didn't know the specifics, had chosen deliberately not to ask, because not asking let her keep a thin and increasingly fragile line between suspicion and certainty. Julian confirmed carefully that for the past 3 years, since Harold first brought him in on a limited professional basis, he had in fact reviewed and drafted a number of contracts on Harold's behalf, initially without full knowledge of the family relationships involved, believing himself simply a junior attorney, assisting an aging client with estate planning and business affairs. It was only in the last year, he said, that Harold began explaining, piece by piece, exactly who these documents concerned, and by then, Julian admitted, he had already handled paperwork touching every member of the family, without any of them knowing his name. He said this last part with visible discomfort, aware of how it sounded, aware that no explanation would fully undo the strangeness of having quietly touched their lives for years as a stranger they'd never met. Desmond's face went pale. In a voice that had lost all its earlier fury, replaced now by something closer to fear, he asked whether Julian was aware of a specific transaction from roughly 2 years earlier. The transfer of a struggling subsidiary of the family's construction business, along with its considerable outstanding debts, out of the parent company's holdings and into Desmond's name alone. A transaction that had haunted him every day since, that had cost him sleep, cost him confidence, cost him, at one particularly low point, nearly his marriage, as he struggled under the weight of a failing division he could not understand how he'd ended up responsible for. He remembered the sleepless nights poring over spreadsheets at his kitchen table, his wife Renata finding him there at 2 in the morning more than once, asking gently what had happened to the confident man she married. Julian's expression shifted, the careful neutrality he'd held through the entire reading, finally giving way to something like discomfort. He admitted he remembered the transaction, that he had, in fact, drafted portions of the paperwork himself, under instructions he'd believed at the time came directly from Harold, arriving through the family's usual channels he'd had no reason at the time to distrust. He retrieved the original contract from a separate section of his folder, laid it flat, and pointed to the authorization signature at the bottom of the final page. Simone leaned forward as well, studying the document over her brother's shoulder, and felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her. The sense of watching a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling suddenly click into a shape she didn't want to see. She had always considered Marian the most careful, most responsible member of the family, the one who could be trusted with anything, precisely because she never seemed to want anything for herself. Watching her sister's signature come into view at the bottom of that page, Simone understood that this assumption, too, might have been something she'd simply never had reason to question before today. Desmond leaned forward, expecting his father's signature there, expecting confirmation that Harold himself, in some final act of business calculation none of them had understood, had quietly saddled him with a failing subsidiary's debts. He'd half prepared himself for that possibility over the last 2 years, telling himself even if his father had made the decision, it must have been for reasons he simply hadn't been trusted enough to understand at the time. That, at least, would have been a version of the story he could live with, a father's difficult judgment, rather than a stranger's betrayal. Instead, the signature authorizing the transfer belonged to someone else entirely. It was Marian's. The room didn't erupt this time. It went cold instead, a stillness far more dangerous than any shouting that had come before it. Desmond stared at his sister's signature, at the bottom of a contract he'd never seen, a transaction that had quietly transferred a failing business and its crushing debts onto his own name 2 years earlier, a burden he'd spent those 2 years believing was simply the result of his own poor management, a belief that had cost him not only money, but a measure of self-respect he had never fully recovered. Marian did not deny this one either. There was, by this point, very little left for her to protect. She explained, voice stripped of all its earlier composure, that she'd used a limited power of attorney Harold had granted her years earlier for unrelated estate matters, quietly expanding its use to authorize the subsidiary transfer under Desmond's name, believing at the time the struggling division would eventually recover, and that Desmond, given his business ambitions, would ultimately benefit from full ownership of it, while removing the liability from the parent company's books, strengthened the overall estate she herself stood to inherit a larger share of. When the subsidiary continued declining instead, she admitted, she said nothing, letting her brother absorb losses that were never fully his responsibility, because correcting the record would have meant confessing to the very manipulation now sitting exposed on the desk in front of them. A confession, she told herself, month after month, she'd make eventually, once the timing felt right. That timing never came. After a long silence, Desmond finally spoke again, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened Marian more than shouting ever could. He asked her whether she had any idea what those 2 years had actually cost him. Not just money, but the quiet erosion of his own confidence. The sleepless nights certain he simply wasn't built for the kind of business their father had spent a lifetime mastering. The arguments with his wife about their finances that had nearly ended in separation, all of it built on a story that was never even true. He told her that he had started to believe, deep down, that their father had quietly lost faith in him, that maybe that was why the subsidiary had landed in his name, and that he had carried that private shame everywhere he went for 2 years, into every room, every negotiation, every conversation with his own children about the family business they would one day inherit. Marian sat with the full weight of that for a long moment before answering. She told him, haltingly, that she remembered exactly the moment 2 years earlier when she'd first drawn up the paperwork, late one night alone in this very study, telling herself it was a temporary measure, a way to buy time while the parent company weathered a difficult quarter. She admitted that she had checked on the subsidiary's numbers every month since, watching them decline, and had told herself each time that she would fix it before it did any real damage. A promise she renewed to herself so many times, it eventually stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling, dangerously, like a plan still in progress. It was only sitting here today, she said, watching her brother's face as he understood the truth, that she finally saw the plan for what it actually was. Not a temporary measure at all, but a betrayal she had simply never found the courage to call by its right name. Marian had no answer sufficient to the scale of what she'd done. She told him quietly, she'd convinced herself for 2 years she was one signature away from fixing it, and had simply never found the courage to make that signature, choosing instead to let the silence continue, month after month, because breaking it would have meant admitting exactly what kind of sister she'd allowed herself to become. Simone, who had said little through most of this exchange, finally spoke, her voice trembling with an anger that surprised even her. She told Marian that what hurt worse than the manipulation itself was how easily Marian had let all 3 of them believe, for 2 years, in a version of events that painted Desmond as simply overwhelmed, or unlucky, or not quite cut out for the pressures of running a division of their father's company, when the truth was that their own sister had engineered that exact narrative and then stood by and watched it take root in Desmond's own understanding of himself. She said she didn't know yet whether she could trust anything else Marian had ever told her about the family's business, and Marian, hearing this, had no defense left to offer. Julian, watching the family unravel in front of him in ways far beyond the scope of the inheritance dispute he'd expected to manage, set down his pen and closed the folder. He said, quietly, he hadn't anticipated uncovering something of this scale, that his role as executor was never meant to expose family betrayals unrelated to his own claim, and that given what had just come to light, he believed it was more appropriate for an independent third party, rather than himself, someone with his own stake and his own complicated history in this family, to continue overseeing the estate. He began gathering his papers, preparing to formally step back, telling them he would recommend a neutral attorney from outside the family's usual circle to take over from here. Before he could rise from his chair, the study door, locked the entire time, opened from the outside, and an elderly woman none of the siblings had ever seen stepped quietly into the room. "Don't," she said, looking directly at Julian. "There's one more thing Harold asked me to give you." Only after this exact moment happened. The woman was Eleanor Cole, 71 years old now, her hair fully silver, her bearing quiet but unmistakably composed, the way someone becomes when they've spent a lifetime absorbing hard truths without losing themselves in them. She wore a modest gray cardigan over a simple dress, the kind of unassuming elegance that comes from a lifetime of never having anything handed to her. Julian rose immediately, clearly startled by his mother's presence, having believed she'd stayed home during the reading, as they'd originally planned. He asked, concerned, how she'd gotten into the house, and how she'd known the exact moment to arrive, given the study door had stayed locked the entire time. Eleanor explained she'd been waiting in a car outside the property for the last 2 hours, following instructions Harold had left her years earlier. Instructions precise enough to include a prearranged phone call from Miss Odessa that would signal the exact moment she should come inside. She'd give her son the letter, she said, only if a particular sequence of events unfolded exactly as Harold predicted. Julian discovering his own place in the family reacting with hostility, and, crucially, Julian himself attempting to step back from his role once the situation grew too painful to keep managing. Harold, it seemed, had understood his son's character better after 3 years of careful observation than Julian had realized. Marian, listening to this, felt something colder settle over her than even the earlier revelations had produced. The understanding that her father, in his final years, had anticipated not only Julian's arrival, but the family's entire reaction to it, including, apparently, her own long-buried manipulation of Desmond's finances, a possibility Harold seemed to have suspected long before any of them had spoken it aloud in this room. Desmond studied Eleanor for a long moment, trying to reconcile the composed, dignified woman standing in the doorway with the vague, half-remembered stories he'd absorbed as a child about a secretary who'd simply disappeared 1 year. He found himself, unexpectedly, feeling something like shame on behalf of a family that had once treated a woman like her as a problem to be paid off and erased, rather than a person deserving of honesty. He rose from his chair, the first of the siblings to do so, and offered Eleanor his own seat, a small gesture that seemed to catch even him by surprise. Before Julian opened the letter, Eleanor crossed the room and stood a moment in front of Marian, studying the face of the child she'd known briefly, decades earlier, now a woman past 50, carrying the same lines of worry Eleanor herself had carried for years. "I remember you," Eleanor said quietly. "You used to draw pictures at my desk while you waited on your father to finish his meetings. You gave me one of those pictures once, a little house with too many windows, and told me it was the house you were going to build me someday. I always wondered what became of you." Marian, unable to summon words adequate to the moment, only nodded, tears finally slipping free after 2 hours of careful restraint, and something passed between the two women neither of the others in the room could fully name, an old, interrupted thread of familiarity being tied off after 38 years of silence. Eleanor handed Julian the envelope, and he opened it there in front of them, reading Harold's final letter aloud, in a voice that grew noticeably unsteady, pausing more than once to compose himself before continuing. The letter explained Harold had not written his will simply to correct one old injustice by including Julian in the estate. He had grown, in his final years, increasingly concerned about patterns of quiet manipulation he'd begun to notice in the family's business dealings, patterns he couldn't fully prove during his lifetime, but suspected strongly enough to build a safeguard against, having watched, with growing unease, certain financial decisions that never quite added up the way they were explained to him. He wrote that he had built this business out of nothing, fighting for every acre of land and every line of credit, in a world designed to see him fail, and that the thought of it being quietly dismantled from the inside, by his own children's hidden resentments and fears, troubled him more than any outside threat ever had. His true final wish, the letter explained, was not for Julian to inherit 20% of the estate as a simple windfall, but to inherit oversight of the estate's ongoing management, specifically as an impartial check against exactly the kind of manipulation that had, apparently, already occurred. Someone with no old loyalties to protect, and no old grievances clouding his judgment. The letter's final paragraph laid out a single condition. Julian would only receive his 20% if he used his authority as executor to fully investigate and expose the truth behind any hidden manipulation of the family's assets, including, the letter specified with unsettling precision, whatever had happened with the subsidiary transferred into Desmond's name 2 years earlier, regardless of who that truth might implicate, and regardless of how much damage its exposure might cause. Harold had written in his own final line that he would rather his family face one difficult day of honesty than another 40 years of the silence that had cost him his own chance to know his son. Julian set the letter down slowly, understanding now the full weight of what his father had asked of him. Harold had not simply wanted to give his overlooked son a place at the family table. He'd wanted Julian, an outsider with no lifelong loyalties to protect and no old grievances clouding his judgment, to serve as the one person capable of holding the family accountable for whatever it had hidden from itself over the years, even if the cost of that accountability was Julian's own comfortable place within it, even if it meant destroying, on his very first day as a member of this family, whatever fragile welcome he might otherwise have received. The room sat with this for a long moment. Desmond, still absorbing Marion's betrayal, now understood his own restoration, financial and otherwise, hinged on Julian's willingness to follow through on a mandate that would require publicly exposing his own sister, a mandate that put Julian in the impossible position of protecting Marion at Desmond's expense, or protecting Desmond at the cost of alienating Marion entirely, on his very first day among people still deciding whether to accept him as family at all. Marion sat very still, aware that whatever authority she'd once held over the family's business affairs was almost certainly about to end, and aware, too, that she had no one to blame but the choices she'd made years earlier, choices that had felt, at the time, like reasonable protections rather than the betrayals they'd become. It was Simone who finally spoke, turning to Julian with an expression that had softened considerably since the anger of earlier chapters. She admitted her initial shock at his arrival had, over the course of this single long afternoon, given way to something closer to respect. Watching him carry information that could easily have been used for his own advantage, and instead treat it, consistently, as a responsibility rather than a weapon, a restraint she wasn't certain she would have managed herself. In his position, after a lifetime of being denied a father he had every right to know, she urged him, quietly, to honor their father's final wish, regardless of what it cost Marion, or what it meant for the fragile new relationship the four of them were only beginning to build. A family built on another buried secret, she told him, was not a family worth protecting. We've already lost enough years to silence, she said. I don't want to lose any more. Desmond, surprising even himself, added quietly that he agreed with his younger sister, though it cost him something to say it out loud, with Marion sitting right there listening. He said that as angry as he still was, he understood now that the anger he'd carried for 2 years toward his own perceived failure had been worse, in some ways, than the anger he felt now toward the truth. At least the truth, however painful, was something he could finally stand on. He would rather know exactly where he stood with every person in that room, he said, than spend one more year quietly wondering what else had been hidden from him. Julian didn't answer right away. He sat with the letter in front of him for a long time, weighing, visibly, the cost of the 2 paths available to him, expose the full truth, and fracture this family perhaps permanently, in the process of finally being honest with itself. Or quietly absorb what he'd learned, accept his inheritance without conditions, and let the Jennings family continue, as it always had, its deepest fractures paved over instead of repaired. Exactly the kind of comfortable silence his own existence had once been buried beneath for 38 years. He thought, in that moment, of his mother's own quiet endurance across nearly 4 decades, of every birthday celebrated without a father present, every question about his origins, gently deflected, rather than answered with resentment she could do nothing about. He thought, too, of the old man he'd come to know only in the final 3 years of his life. A man who'd spent decades avoiding exactly the kind of difficult honesty he was now, from beyond his own death, demanding of his son. Julian understood that whatever he chose in the next few minutes would define not only his relationship with this family, but his answer to the question his father had implicitly asked him from the grave: whether he intended to break the pattern of comfortable silence that had shaped 3 generations of this family, or continue it. He thought, too, of his own years of legal training, the countless hours spent studying cases where families tore each other apart over money, over pride, over secrets kept a decade too long, and how he had always believed, from the safety of a courtroom or a conference room, that he would know exactly what justice looked like when he saw it. Sitting now on the other side of exactly that kind of case, with his own name and his own blood tangled into every decision, he understood for the first time how much easier justice was to define from a distance than to actually deliver from inside the wreckage of a real family's pain. Finally, he rose from his chair, walked to the study door, and unlocked it for the first time since the reading began. He turned back to face all 3 of his newly discovered siblings, his mother standing quietly near the doorway behind him. "I've made my decision," he said, "and it's going to cost one of you everything." Julian's decision, when he laid it out over the following hour, was neither the quiet burial Marian had perhaps hoped for, nor the public destruction Desmond's earlier fury might once have demanded. It was, instead, precisely what Harold had designed it to be: an act of accountability calibrated toward repair rather than ruin. And it took the better part of the afternoon to walk the family through every detail, question by question, until each of them understood exactly what would happen next. Desmond was restored in full. The subsidiary transferred into his name 2 years earlier, along with its outstanding debts, was returned to the parent estate's holdings, and Desmond was granted, in its place, a controlling stake in a healthier division of the family business, one that reflected the responsibility Harold had always believed his son capable of carrying, if only he'd been given an honest chance to carry it. For the first time in 2 years, Desmond understood that his struggles had never been a reflection of his own failure, and something in his posture visibly lifted as the reality settled over him, 2 years of quiet self-doubt lifting all at once. He called his wife from the hallway outside the study the moment the terms were finalized, his voice breaking slightly as he explained, for the first time in 2 years, exactly what had actually happened to the business she'd watched him agonize over night after night. Renata was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before telling him she'd never once believed the failure was truly his, and that she was glad, finally, to hear him believe it too. He stood in that hallway a long time afterward, phone still in his hand, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like the ground beneath him was solid again. Marian's punishment was quieter than exposure to the courts, but no less final within the family itself. Julian formally removed her from her position as co-executor of the estate's ongoing business interests, a role she'd held for over a decade, and required, as a condition of retaining her own inheritance in full, that she provide a complete and documented account of the subsidiary manipulation to both Desmond and an independent auditor retained by the estate. The auditor's review took nearly 6 weeks, during which Marian answered every question put to her without evasion, a discipline she'd rarely shown until that point, driven less by fear of consequence than by a genuine desire, for the first time, to be fully known by the people she loved rather than carefully managed. Julian stopped short of pursuing criminal charges, explaining to Marian privately, once the others had briefly stepped out, that their father's letter had called for truth and accountability, not vengeance, and that a family already fractured by decades of silence didn't need to be fractured further by prison sentences and public scandal. Marian accepted the terms without argument, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the quiet manipulations she'd spent years justifying to herself had cost her not only her brother's trust, but her own father's final faith in her judgment, a loss she suspected she'd spend the rest of her life trying to repair. Simone, who had held the family's fragile center together through nearly every chapter of that long afternoon, was named the estate's new family mediator, a role Harold's letter had apparently anticipated might be necessary, though he'd left the choice of who should fill it to Julian's discretion. It was a role Simone had, in some sense, already been playing her entire life, quietly noticing what others missed, asking the questions no one else dared to ask, and she accepted it with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through the whole afternoon. She would spend the following months meeting individually with Marian and Desmond, helping each of them find language for grievances they'd carried silently for years, and more than once she found herself thinking that her father, whatever his failures, had chosen well in trusting her with this particular task. She had always been the sibling who noticed the cracks before anyone else, and now, finally, she had been given the authority to actually help mend them, rather than simply watching from the sidelines as she always had. And Julian accepted his 20%, not as a stranger claiming a windfall from a family that never knew him, but as the son Harold Jennings had spent 38 years failing to protect, and had spent his final years trying, however imperfectly, to make right. He told his newfound siblings he'd need time before he could think of himself as truly part of this family, rather than simply its accountant of secrets, and all three of them, in their own separate ways, told him that time was something they were finally willing to give. In the weeks that followed, the four of them met more often than any of them expected. First out of the practical necessity of untangling the estate's finances, later, gradually, out of something closer to genuine curiosity about one another. Desmond took Julian to lunch alone one afternoon, without Marian or Simone present, at a small soul food restaurant their father used to love, and admitted, somewhat awkwardly, over plates of smothered chicken and greens, that he'd spent most of his life wishing for a brother, and never once imagined the wish would be answered this way. Julian, for his part, found himself calling Simone more than once, just to ask her opinion on some minor estate matter that could easily have waited, and admitted to his mother one evening that he'd begun to feel something he never expected to feel toward people he'd known less than a month, something that resembled, however cautiously, belonging. Nearly a year later, the family gathered again at the house on Sweetwater Ridge, this time for a far gentler occasion. A small dinner Simone had organized to mark the anniversary of their father's passing, and, though no one said it aloud, to mark the year since the truth had finally come into the light. Eleanor was there too, seated at the table for the first time in 38 years, in a chair that had once belonged to a family that erased her. Desmond raised a glass and offered a toast, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been that first afternoon in the locked study, thanking his father, wherever he was, for finally finding the courage his own children had needed him to find, decades earlier. Marian, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, found herself, for the first time since the reading, at peace with the woman she had become in the aftermath of her own reckoning, not because the guilt had disappeared, but because she had finally stopped running from it. Eleanor watched from the study doorway as her son took his place among the family that had once erased them both from its story, her expression carrying the particular quiet of someone who'd waited nearly 4 decades to see a wrong, even partially, righted, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide. She thought, watching her son speak with something close to authority to the siblings who'd spent the morning doubting his very existence, of every year she'd spent building a small, steady life out of a situation she'd never chosen, never once telling Julian to resent the father who wasn't there, never once poisoning him against a family he had every reason to feel bitter toward. She'd told herself across those decades that dignity mattered more than vindication, and standing now in the doorway of a house she'd once been paid to disappear from, she allowed herself, finally, the smallest measure of the vindication she'd never asked for, and had certainly earned. As the family finally began to rise and leave the study, the long afternoon of revelations behind them, Marian turned back one last time and asked the question none of them had yet dared to ask aloud. "Does this mean," she said, "there's a 5th child we don't know about too? If this story moved you, tell me in the comments which chapter hit hardest. And don't forget to subscribe to Her Mind Maze Tales for more emotional family dramas every week.